Hey everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of Pathfinder titled The State of the Space Industry, where we will be covering the top stories and trends from this past year around four key areas of the market: launch, OSAM, or On-Orbit Servicing Assembly and Manufacturing, Earth Observation, and SATCOM. We're in conjunction releasing an article series on these areas in our flagship newsletter, which if you're not already signed up for, you can sign up for at www.payloadspace.com. My guests are members of the Payload editorial team who will be discussing what they've learned during the article production process, particularly as they've interviewed various executives and stakeholders. We cover a lot, so we've broken up the series into two episodes. First, we'll be covering launch and OSAM, and next week we'll be covering EO and SATCOM. But before we dive into today's episode, a quick word from our sponsors. This year at the National Space Symposium in Colorado Springs, be sure to drop by the Italian Pavilion and say hi to the Italian Trade Agency. They'll be joined by 12 groundbreaking companies showcasing their technologies all under one roof. From aerospace giants to pioneering startups, the Italian Pavilion this year represents a diverse spectrum of expertise and creativity, combining both tradition and innovation. Moreover, this year will see the largest Italian delegation the conference has ever seen in attendance. You can find them in South Hall, booth 603, or you might just want to follow the smell of espresso. On April 9th at 3:30 p.m., the president of the Italian Space Agency will join the pavilion for a networking event open to all attendees. Don't miss out. Jacqueline, welcome. You are a veteran on the show, but for any new listeners, tell us a little bit about who you are and your role at Payload.
Yeah, so I am the managing editor of Payload. So I oversee the daily newsletter and the newsroom and kind of all of our editorial strategy.
So I want to start with a softball. I know you were in charge for our State of the Space Industry 2023. You were in charge of launch. So you covered launch. So how do you think the launch market? Let's not include SpaceX because SpaceX is doing very, very well. They launched I think 92 times, 93 times, something like that in 2023. They're trying to do a lot more this year, so they're kind of rocking and rolling. But the broader launch market outside of SpaceX, how did it fare last year?
So I would call it a building year. I'm a baseball fan, and the Washington Nationals here have had a series of building years. But I would say that 2023 was very much a building year for the launch industry. And this is kind of 2024 is kind of the make or break year. I mean, this year we're seeing more than a dozen new launch vehicles trying to get to the pad for the first time. We're seeing the funding environment get more of a struggle. So really only the best ideas are getting funded. This year, I think, is really, we're going to at least start to answer the big question of who is going to make it and who is going to fail. So I think last year very much like led into this year, set us up well for this very interesting kind of big make or break year for the industry.
I know you I know you interviewed a number of folks. Who are some of the executives that you had a chance to interview for the piece?
I chatted with Peter Beck from Rocket Lab, Tim Ellis from Relativity, Tory Bruno from ULA. And then for like an outside industry perspective, I talked with Mike French, who is the head of the space program at the Aerospace Industries Association. So he's kind of a broader industry watcher. We talked about SpaceX, elephant in the room. Obviously would have loved to have them, but they have not gotten back to me, and neither has Blue Origin as of yet, though fingers crossed that will change by the time we publish the article.
Yeah. All right. Well, there you go. I'll let you start with who you'd like to start. I would love to get sort of like, maybe key takeaways from each of your interviews, but maybe we can start with Peter Beck. One of the things that's been very obvious, obviously Rocket Lab is a public company. Stock's been sort of all over the place. They have Neutron that they're planning to launch later this year, which is their medium-sized launch vehicle, reusable launch vehicle. But one of the interesting things is Rocket Lab has pursued a number of acquisitions lately, and it's very clear that a significant portion of their revenue comes from satellite manufacturing satellite services. Did Peter give any indication, or did you guys talk a little bit about like what has prompted him to diversify?
Yeah, we did. He basically said, launch is the keys to space. And once you have the keys to space, would you rather be transporting other people's stuff or transporting your own stuff to offer services that you can then make revenue from? So to him, it was a very clear value proposition. And he predicted that this will kind of be the way forward for the launch industry, that we won't see strictly launch companies, that launch companies will begin to offer services that they launch or build spacecraft that they launch. And, we're obviously seeing that in a number of other launch companies. SpaceX has Starlink. Blue Origin is doing seemingly everything. They have CLDs, they have lunar landers, they have space tourism, the suborbital flights. So yeah, I mean, he predicted this is going to be the way of the future. I think that's still very much up in the air. There are obviously, Tory Bruno at ULA is very much on the other side of the spectrum in the camp of we do launch and that's it. So I think it'll be an interesting thing to kind of watch how it plays out over the next couple of years. But kind of the one key takeaway from the story is that there's been this transition that launch companies are no longer just launch companies by and large.
Yeah. You mentioned ULA. Obviously, they've been sort of the talk of the town outside SpaceX. I know they're probably pretty close to the vest about what's going on with the acquisition, whether it's Blue, that looks like the front runner, or Cerberus, but it does sound like it's going to be Blue. So I'm sure he didn't give you much on that. But how was the interview with Tory? Anything interesting that you learned?
Yeah, I mean, he's always a great interview, as expected. I had to ask the questions about the acquisition, and he basically was like, even if I knew more, I wouldn't tell you, which is what you'd expect. He actually had, he obviously talked about ULA's business model being purely launch, saying that his focus is on upgrading Vulcan, that, we're not in the realm where you can just build a rocket and let that rocket stand. You need to be constantly upgrading the rocket to make it the best it can be. And that is going to be their focus, not sort of, diversifying into other realms. They obviously, until the sale happens, their parent companies both do spacecraft and services. So it would be kind of competing within the business if they did that kind of stuff. I talked with some industry executives at the satellite show who, were wondering if their position on that might change once the sale does go through. He also had really interesting thoughts on like the regulatory landscape and on orbital debris, which I personally, I think of orbital debris being like a danger for spacecraft, but he was talking about how, when they launch, you need to sort of thread through like for space traffic management, like the launch needs to thread through these clouds of satellites, and the clouds are getting bigger and bigger with these mega constellations. So he talked about kind of one of the regulatory realms that he's watching in the upcoming year is orbital debris and the impact that has on kind of the length of launch windows and how, it can get very, very shortened if too much stuff is
Right.
going on in space.
I was going to ask you if you thought that their strategy of just focusing on launch is sustainable long term, but it sounds like your feeling is that post acquisition, what Tory's saying could definitely evolve.
Yeah, that's speculation I heard from, some other people in the
Right.
industry. I think it's possible. I also, everyone I talked to said that the biggest challenge facing the launch industry this year is supply, that there's not enough launch to go around, and that launch is the limiting factor for everything else that people want to do in space. So, is it bad business to have just a launch company when that's the thing that's in the greatest demand? Like, I see his
Fair point.
argument. But yeah, I think, everyone's obviously watching closely what's going to happen with that acquisition and how the business model might change after that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think those are fair points. The only issue is that, like, we've gone through, and it's funny. I actually go on SpaceX's website fairly frequently, and I go on their rideshare like link because it's funny. It's like an e-commerce workflow. And I'm just like, hey, I wonder when, if I had a 500 kilogram satellite I wanted to send to LEO or SSO, or, when is the next available? So for LEO, there's like nothing available. Now, it's possible that there is, but there's like, you have to go through other channels. But, for SSO, I think like I checked like a week ago and it was like the next available date was like October, like of this year, maybe, or like later this year. Anyway, the point is like, it's very clear that if you want to go book a launch, it's actually quite difficult. So yeah, at the same time, you do have a lot of new launchers that are supposed to come online in the next year and a half. So you might end up getting a lot of more supply, but of course there still needs to be flight heritage around a lot of those launch vehicles before customers, I think, really get comfortable with them. So I think it's fair. It's interesting. On your comments, your Peter comments earlier. So he mentioned once you have launch, you want to start, going into other businesses that otherwise your competitors are capturing. And I agree with that. I think once you have like a working launch vehicle, I actually oftentimes find it a red flag when a launch company that has not made it to orbit comes out and says, oh, by the way, we're also doing, we're also building satellites, and we're also going to have a constellation of this and that. And I think it's oftentimes a investor tactic because, like, hey, we haven't launched into orbit yet. We've made some milestones, but they're not enough to go out and raise more money at a higher valuation. So we're going to launch this new business model and open up our, TAM, our addressable market, and justify a higher price, right? So I have seen some of that. In the past, it's slowed down a little bit, but there's still some of that going on. I want to get to Tim. So you did chat with Tim Ellis. How was that conversation? How often did 3D printing come up? Just because the way that company is thinking about additive manufacturing, 3D printing has evolved even in the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. I asked him about 3D printing through the lens of, all these other launch companies have kind of these side businesses. Is 3D printing Relativity's side business? And he was very clear that it's not. 3D printing for them is the enabler to be able to, iterate quickly and build quickly. And he highlighted how quickly they went from a blank sheet design to a full flight duration engine tests last year on their brand new rocket. And so that was really only possible because of 3D printing. And while they do have, a couple government contracts for 3D printing, he was very clear that they are not a 3D printing company that launches, right? That I think he sees himself more in the ULA camp of, we are a launch company. We happen to build our launch vehicles this cool way that we can do for other people. But that 3D printing is really something that enables launch, not a separate business for them.
Got it. And does Tim? Did you talk a little? Did you talk about how he views it as a competitive advantage? Does Relativity still view 3D printing as a huge advantage? Obviously, a lot of other launch companies are now employing that technology, and there's certain parts that Relativity originally said they were going to 3D print, but now they're not 3D printing anymore because it just sounds like the old school way of rolling sheet metal into into a rocket body just works better.
Yeah, I think he does still see it as a big advantage, even though the company has, pulled back from 3D printing some parts, mostly because it does allow them to move so quickly and, go through different designs, build those designs quickly. He really credited that with being a reason that they've been able to go as fast as they have. Granted, it's not like the new rocket has flown yet,
Right.
but he I think does still see that as like a key enabler of the business, and they're fully committed to it.
What do you think will determine winners and losers in launch?
I think it's going to be funding at this point. That a lot of people talked about the difficult funding environment and how, you can't just go out and fundraise on a hope and a dream at this point, right? Like, you need to have a good airtight business model. And Tory Bruno from ULA told me that, even solid ideas and good business models aren't getting funded in this environment anymore. So we're seeing good ideas not be able to fundraise. I think the ability to fundraise is really going to be key. Peter Beck, I asked each of the players to kind of, this is obviously loosely based on State of the Union, and the president always says the State of the Union is strong. So I asked each of these leaders to fill in like the state of the launch industry is with like a word or a phrase. And Peter Beck told me the state of the launch industry is no longer about fluff; it's all about execution. And that's really how I see about winners and losers, like who can actually raise money and execute on it versus, pitching a lot of great ideas that might take years or decades to come to fruition.
How do you think the government is viewing launch outside SpaceX right now? There's the Victus Nox mission, obviously worth mentioning, that Firefly was able to nail for the DoD, which proved the rapid response capability, and the government is spending a lot more time in that one area where they're like, I think there's economic launch, which SpaceX owns, the cheapest per kilogram to any orbit. And then there's responsive launch, which is like, how do we get to a destination as quickly as possible? But just in general, how do you think the government's view towards launch has evolved?
Yeah, I think within the national security realm, there's obviously a huge focus on responsive launch. There was a similar challenge. It was like the Google Lunar X Prize for responsive launch, maybe five years ago, but no one could do it. No one was able to notch, to hit the milestones. And now, with Victus Nox, we're seeing being able to launch on, I think it was 27, 29 hours. And the only reason it went over was because I had to wait for the launch window. So, to see advances in responsive launch, I think that's a huge focus for the government. I also think on the more regulatory side, the FAA has requested this giant budget increase for fiscal 2025 because, you said except for SpaceX, but SpaceX is launching a ton and everyone's launching a ton. And these companies, especially new vehicles, can really only launch as quickly as they can be authorized by regulators. So I know one thing Mike French talked about watching for the year over at AIA is like the rise of spaceports. Like, we need to, regulators need to allow stuff quickly, but there's also this congestion on the launch ranges. So I think, the government is thinking about, do we need more places to launch? And I think that will be, something to watch as well.
What are you most excited about for 2024?
What am I most excited about? I mean, I think we're all excited to see Starship. I know we're trying to talk about the rest of the launch industry, but seeing what's next for Starship when it starts flying operational missions, I think is really interesting. As a DC policy nerd, I'm obviously excited to see the regulatory stuff. FAA is doing a review of the Part 450 regulations that involve licensing launch. So watching how that can be streamlined, how it can make companies' lives easier. And then on the M&A front, obviously the ULA sale, I think will be a huge shakeup to the industry, whether it's Blue or whether it's someone else. I mean, ULA has been a giant, was the only launcher of military missions for so long. And Tory Bruno said, I think the launch industry is in such a better place because we used to be the only one and now there's all this competition. So to see where they end up and what it means for them, I think will be really interesting.
Who do you think ends up buying them?
I think it's probably Blue. I think Payload Research made a very convincing case for Blue.
All right. Well, there you go. And then, do you think that deal's going to close this year?
I mean, if I'm looking at it like a crystal ball, I would guess probably. I feel like it's been talked about for a long time, and I feel like they're probably eager to get it just done and out of the news. I wouldn't want it to be talked about that much if I was them, and would be eager to finish it.
Let me ask you a question that deserves its own probably hour-long podcast. But if you were to give me a very quick answer, do you think this is an acquisition that makes sense for Blue Origin?
I do. I think, ULA brings 100% success rate. They bring a lot of flight heritage. I think with government customers, especially, I think they bring a level of comfort and credibility that, while Blue has been around for a while, like New Glenn hasn't flown yet. And I think, they are seen as like a newer space company. So I think like putting aside like the technology aspect of it, I think like the reputational aspect of ULA is a value add.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be a very interesting year, regardless, even outside of ULA and outside Starship. I mean, even just in the U.S., we have, we have Rocket Lab, we have ABL, we have Firefly, we have Relativity, who are all, fairly far along in their development or in development of their current launch vehicle or their next generation launch vehicle. Stoke obviously is out there doing really cool things with second stage reusability. But like you said, the make or break is going to be on the financing. Every single one of these companies needs more money. Maybe not Rocket Lab. We'll see. I don't buy that they're not going to need more money, but everyone's going to need more money. They're going to tap the capital markets. And do investors have the appetite to fund other providers at the scale that every single one of these companies still needs hundreds of millions of dollars, if not, in certain cases, $1 billion plus. And that sort of like appetite is not what it used to be, not a couple years ago. So I think it'll be really interesting over the next year. Maybe there's some consolidation. Maybe there's a player or two that goes away. I don't know. We'll have to see. But Jacqueline, thanks so much. Appreciate you being with us.
Thank you.
Tim, welcome to the show.
Good to have you. It's a pleasure to make my first appearance.
That's right. It is your first appearance. That is right. Well, I'm sure you've seen, we have done full length episodes with most people on the team now. So you are definitely going to be very soon a guest in the hot seat. So, and we're going to talk about you and your background, but not today. But for new listeners, I do want you to give us a very quick, who are you and what do you do at Payload?
Sure. I am Tim Fernholz. I'm a journalist. I write about space companies, which I've been doing for more than a decade now. And at Payload, I am writing for the newsletter and doing in-depth reporting on all of the cool folks building the extraterrestrial economy.
Amazing. So you helped for our series cover OSAM, so on-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. So let's just start with the basics really quickly. What is OSAM? What are the underlying businesses underneath that umbrella?
Sure. So you defined it as orbital servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. Basically, it is kind of a grab bag. Not all of these businesses are really related, but they all rely on similar technologies, and they're all responding to the big change in the space economy of the last decade, which is the increasing cadence of launch, more assets on orbit, more investment in orbital stuff, and commensurately more debris and junk and traffic problems. But the three big things that we're talking about are refueling and servicing satellites to extend their lives. We're talking about clearing debris or deorbiting defunct spacecraft bodies. We're talking about manufacturing goods in microgravity, like on the International Space Station. And then we're talking about assembling large structures in space. So you think about how the ISS was built of a bunch of components. What if we wanted to build a large platform for a space telescope or a space-based solar power system? That's what those folks are talking about. And I think those are the big four buckets that we really care about right now. You could also talk about what's called ISAM, which is not orbital, but in space for all those three things. And that's really focused on, say, resources at the moon, building,
Sure.
Bunkers out of regolith or asteroid, mining. But that's a little far off maybe for our purposes today.
So really OSAM, ISAM, the difference is just one's Earth orbit, one is beyond Earth orbit.
Yeah, it's orbital versus in space, and there are a variety of opinions of which is the most appropriate, but I think
Sure.
OSAM is maybe the most parsimonious.
And you alluded to it a little bit, but are there any core capabilities worth highlighting that sort of unite all of this activity?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a handful. One is RPO, rendezvous and proximity operations. If you want to service a satellite, you have to get up close to it without smashing into it. Or
Yep.
if you're manufacturing stuff on orbit, you need a supply chain that's going to be bringing your goods back and forth. Robotics is a big deal here because we don't want to have astronauts be doing this stuff. It's too expensive. But we need to do some pretty tricky and delicate tasks. So advanced robotics are a big deal here. Sensors and GNC for doing those approach. And then sort of a variety of ways to automate manufacturing. There's a couple different companies like Redwire, for example, which acquired Made in Space, that have built facilities on the ISS that are pumping out different kinds of manufactured goods.
How do you think the OSAM market in general fared in 2023? How would you rate it? Bad, good, great.
Well, it's interesting. Unlike, say, SATCOM or launch or Earth observation, which are the three other buckets in this series, OSAM is a little more nascent. It's a little new. So there were a lot of exciting things going on. We had some good demo missions. We had some fundraising and policy. But we're right now at this stage where maybe we were 4 or 5 years ago for Earth observation, where we have companies that have announced business models that are developing technology, they're putting demos on orbit, but we don't actually have, daily servicing of satellites. And we'll talk about why it's a little trickier in a second, I think.
Yeah. Well, let's jump right into that. What are the challenges that you think companies are facing when they're building in this market? And are there any highlights from 23 that you think are worth highlighting?
So for this market, I mean, the big thing is it's a chicken and egg problem, which everyone in this industry will tell you. And the business model is often harder than the technology. If you think about satellites, right, they're not really built to be serviced. No one has been going to refuel them. And so satellite builders don't want to invest in putting a fuel port on the outside, for example. And then if you're someone who wants to start a company that is refueling satellites in orbit, you don't have anyone to go refuel. So it's who's going to invest and put that marker down to open up this market. And unsurprisingly to anyone, probably the answer is the government. And so a lot of what we see right now in the industry is government partnerships from DARPA, DIU, NASA, trying to get folks to do this stuff, and a lot of discussions about regulation and standards so that there's less risk and uncertainty for people who want to put $10 million or something into one of these companies.
So, Tim, maybe where do you see the gaps in technology right now that maybe still remain for the market? Well, there's the demand side, yes, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But on the technology side, what do you think is missing?
I think there are a couple things, maybe not missing, but are not as advanced. So we mentioned RPO technology. There are several companies that are doing that pretty well, several demos on orbit happening right now. But where there has been less advancement probably is robotics, the kind of robotic arms and manipulators that can work in a dynamic environment in space. That's expensive and difficult work. And what we see is some of the leading companies in this area, like Northrop Grumman, are partnering with the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory to do the robotic arm. There are some companies like GTI and Motive that are trying to build their own robotic arms. I mean, they are building them, and I think that's where we're looking for commercially. But it's a technology, as anyone who's worked with industrial robots, that is still pretty nascent in terms of going into unusual environments. And there's actually some hope. People are talking about this in the AI world, that new methods of training robots based on real world data using neural networks might unlock a lot of progress here. So that is something to be excited about. Another challenge is supply chain. So we have a bunch of sort of promising companies and ideas for manufacturing things on orbit. But it's still, even despite the falling cost of launch, hard to get things up and down on the cadence you would want. Varda, which is a company that I should mention in 2023 had a big mission, is trying to make pharmaceuticals and other products in orbit. And they launched their sort of orbiting lab, and they made the pharmaceutical, but then they ran into a lot of regulatory trouble bringing it back. And so they successfully did bring it back after working with the FAA for a while. But if you're like, I need to be manufacturing at a cadence where I'm bringing things back a dozen times a year, obviously there are kinks that need to be worked out. And then the final thing is, we're talking a lot about refueling satellites and spacecraft to extend their life on orbit. But we're mainly focused on hypergolics and on sort of propulsion systems that aren't high thrust. But a lot of the spacecraft that we're talking about for the future use cryogenic fuels that have to be kept very cold. And we still haven't quite figured out the refueling technology on that. And that's something that SpaceX and Blue Origin are working a lot on that we'll need for the kind of orbital economy the OSAM folks want to see.
Do you think, and look, there's no question there will be one, two, three, startups that are going to have successful missions and they're going to demonstrate the technology, get a couple customers, and be on their way. But in general, do you think it's too early for prospective startups to be working on these types of problems? And should it be covered by the primes that have more resources and can spend money on a market that might not exist right now?
It really depends on the business model. In some cases, when you're talking about satellites that are refuelable or serviceable or upgradable, that's almost disruptive to some of the big satellite makers. And so maybe they won't be investing in that, and startups need to come in and really push the market forward. In other cases, primes, and particularly I would say Northrop Grumman, are pretty far ahead in this because of their ability to partner closely with the government and win big government contracts. A big motivation for a lot of what we're seeing in space servicing is that the US Department of Defense wants to move its satellites around a lot more than it currently does. This is something called dynamic space operations, or maneuver without regret, but they don't want to worry about running out of fuel. And so when they are asking someone to solve that problem for them, they go to the Northrop Grummans of the world. And so, for instance, there's a big partnership with DARPA called the Remote Servicing of Geostationary Satellites, RSGS, that we're going to see launch in 2025. And that is DARPA, and that is Northrop Grumman, but you also see smaller companies getting involved as well, like Catalyst, which is a startup that wants to add modular upgrade boxes to satellites. So there's also a lot of partnership here. But it is, I think, it can be difficult for startups right now because it is such an uncertain market. And so you see a lot of folks trying to figure out how to bridge that gap. Orbit Fab is a great example here. They want to be the gas station provider in space. And so they've developed a fuel port called Rafty that they just launched. But they have made it so that it can be used not just for refueling in space, but for normal fueling operations on the ground. And that kind of lets them wedge into the market where if they were just selling this sort of fantastic thing, it might be harder. Now they can solve a very prosaic problem that every satellite maker needs to solve and tee them up for much more advantageous future stuff. So finding those creative solutions, I think, is important.
You talked about this a little earlier on the chicken or the egg. How you mentioned it's crucial for government to help overcome, but how crucial do you think is government in overcoming the chicken and the egg problem that OSAM companies face? And anything you've seen so far that's been effective in helping move these businesses forward?
Yeah, there's a couple things to talk about. I mean, one is regulation. As we see the orbital environment getting more crowded, the FCC has come out and said, any spacecraft in LEO has to deorbit in 5 years. That has made a lot of folks think, okay, well, I need my satellite to be deorbitable, or I need to pay someone to deorbit my satellite. And that is forcing these conversations to happen. And some folks think that the FCC needs to mandate active debris removal, or mandate required propulsion systems on spacecraft to get them out of the way. I don't think we're quite there yet, but you can see how rules like that would force established satellite companies to look to these servicers. If you talk to these companies, they love to say, we want to see a demand signal from the government, which is essentially, we want the government to buy our stuff. And that's really important, and you're going to see that as well with a lot of these DARPA and DIU partnerships, or for instance, NASA partnering with Blue Origin and SpaceX on fuel transfer for the Artemis program. But a lot of it is going to be just sort of convening people for partnerships and setting up standards. The government has brought together a lot of these folks. There's a national ISAM strategy that was released in 2022 that is sort of happening. But it's all about the commitment of the government that, yes, we're going to support orbital servicing, and it helps that it's so important for the military.
Any other organizations outside the FCC that are helping set standards in OSAM?
On the private side, there's a really important organization called CONFERS, which is essentially the trade association of companies that want to do orbital servicing. And so they are coming together and coming up with all kinds of standards for fueling ports, for norms of operations, like a common language to talk about how all these things happen. One of my favorite things that they've done are setting standards for fiducials. So one of the things about RPO and going to visit another satellite, it can be hard to get the autonomous sensors to lock onto it and figure out exactly where it is. But if you put a little sticker on the back with the right number of dots sort of arranged in a specific way and your sensors can see it, they can lock on, and that makes it easier to dock or grapple or just approach that satellite safely. And so it sounds silly to come up with a standard for ID stickers for spacecraft, but that's essentially something Converse is doing, and it is going to make things easier for anybody who wants to get in this business. This wasn't a Converse project necessarily, but the U.S. Space Force just, what's the word I'm looking for, authorized or chose a Northrop Grumman fuel port as a standard, and now that IP is available for anyone making a satellite for the government. And so those steps are kind of boring and bureaucratic, but they're important to create a playing field where these companies can actually do stuff.
Let's talk about a big story in this market, OSAM 1. So tell us a little bit about OSAM 1 and what happened.
Well, it's a really interesting case because it's sort of maybe typical of what's happening in the space market right now, which is in the mid-2010s, NASA came up with a mission to refuel an old Landsat satellite, keep it on orbit longer, keep providing data to the public. That's great. It hired Maxar to build the bus for the spacecraft and a robotic arm. But as the mission progressed, it revealed some difficulties. One is, Landsat was not designed to be refueled. So they're talking about a robotic arm that's going to cut into the fuel tank and rip it open and fuel it and then somehow seal it back up. And if you could imagine if your car didn't have a gas tank and you had to cut into it to fuel it up, that would be hard on Earth. Doing it in space with a robot, even more difficult. And then there were sort of additional requirements added onto this mission to build a communications antenna, to build a truss. And it went sort of delay, over budget, and canceled this year by NASA. And, you might say, oh, well, that's not a great sign for the industry. But one of the reasons that they canceled it that I think is important is that they talked to people in the industry, and there weren't a lot of new capabilities that this was going to give anybody. And so they're actually taking the money and putting it into a bunch of other demonstration missions, including some cryogenic fueling ones. And I think that's important because that is a little further out on the technology tree, and now we're sort of addressing government money at a problem that needs to be solved. Congress has maybe disagreed with NASA's decision to cancel it. We'll see how that all works out. But it shows how fast commercial is moving right now compared to some of the traditional approaches to this sort of thing.
Right. So what you're saying is, yes, OSAM 1 canceled, on its surface, doesn't sound like a great thing, but ultimately the implications of it are actually quite positive in that, NASA listened to customers and realized customers or other partners and realized that, hey, this doesn't really make sense for us to be pursuing.
That's my interpretation.
Yeah. Anything to be excited about in 2024?
Yeah, there's a lot of cool things going on. One is Northrop Grumman is supposed to launch its mission robotic vehicle, which is a spacecraft that can fly up to other satellites in geostationary orbit, refuel them, extend their lives, perhaps deorbit them or move them to a junk orbit. And this is the first mission for this, but it's going to stay up there and keep performing it. They're going to launch probably another one with DARPA. And so it's going to be exciting. We will have robots actually performing satellite servicing on orbit. We should mention, I don't think we have yet, that MRV is an upgrade from Northrop's previous mission extension vehicle, which was a spacecraft that just went up and clamped onto one satellite and pushed it to a higher orbit. So this new MRV is going to be even more flexible and reusable. I think it's a really cool mission to look forward to. As we speak, Astroscale, which is a US-Japanese company, has its ADRAS-J mission on orbit. And it is a spacecraft that is going to find an old Japanese rocket body that's hanging out in space. It's going to rendezvous with it, and it's going to inspect it, circle it a bunch of times, figure out exactly its shape, its size, where it's moving, how it's tumbling, all of these things. And that is the first step towards a second mission that Astroscale hopes to do, which is grabbing that rocket body and pulling it down to deorbit it. And that's a demo for the kind of active debris removal that some folks think is necessary now to protect the orbital environment. And I think anyone who anticipates, tens of thousands of new spacecraft in orbit over the next couple of years, it's going to become necessary. So that's a really cool one. Another thing to look out for, as SpaceX is launching Starship, it's going to be performing more refueling demonstrations with NASA to show that it can move cryogenic fuel in space. Even on the last Starship 3 test flight, they did sort of an internal tanking test, but we can expect to see more as Starship keeps going, and that's going to tee us up for a moon landing, which is pretty neat. And then the other thing that's exciting, and we're still waiting on, there were a couple of RPO missions that went up on the most recent SpaceX transporter. One is a company called True Anomaly, which is trying to build inspection spacecraft for the US military. And they're going to try and do sort of a ballet in space with their spacecraft to prove out RPO tech. And what's exciting about that is this is a company that's very new. It built these spacecraft very quickly, it put them on orbit, had some trouble sort of linking up with them. But what it shows is you don't need a ton of money these days to put maneuverable spacecraft on orbit. And I think that speaks to the future of what we're going to expect in the years ahead.
Very exciting, Tim. Thank you. That was a great overview.
All right. And it's a pleasure to talk about it.
And great first day in the hot seat. You're gonna. Ooh. I'm excited for when we have you here for a full hour.
I'm terrified.
Thanks so much, Tim. Till next time.
See you later.